First, let me toot my own horn and that of a few other people. For at least a decade, I've been writing that the U.S. economy was being destroyed by Wall Street and the corporations who were enriching themselves by moving American jobs offshore. And when you move the jobs offshore, you move consumer incomes offshore, you move gross domestic product offshore, you move know-how, technology, and you move entire supply chains, because when you move manufacturing off, sooner or later, design follows, research, development. And so it was easy to see that the result of this policy of moving American jobs offshore would be the decimation of the United States economy and a rising trade deficit. Because when the offshored production is brought back home to be sold, it comes in as imports. And so you see a terrific worsening in the trade deficit, but also in the budget deficit, because when you move the country's GDP offshore, you're moving the tax base offshore. And so tax revenues go down. So here was a process that was enriching Wall Street and corporate CEOs and shareholders at the expense of the financial condition of the United States government, and also at the expense of the dollar, because it's impossible for a reserve currency to indefinitely survive very large and rising trade and budget deficits, because people see huge quantities of the reserve currency popping up everywhere, and they start to wonder, is this funny money? How can this be a reserve currency? This is funny money. So this is how the whole problem was produced. Now, for 10 years, as I emphasize this, and let me say, I wasn't the first. Herman Daly, who was a World Bank economist and recently retired professor from the University of Maryland, he certainly was out there with these points. I think also Charles Macmillan, an economic consultant in Washington, D.C., they were ignored, as was I. And also for a decade, the distinguished mathematician and probably the world's best trade economist, Ralph Gomory, has been hitting these points. And again, very little attention, despite his position, was given to it. But now what has happened? Just the other day, we've had a paper from the Council on Foreign Relations, written by Michael Spence, a Nobel Prize winner in economics, along with a researcher at New York University, whose name I can't pronounce. And lo and behold, what do? They say precisely what I've been saying for a decade, what Gomory has been saying, what Herman Daly has been saying, Charles Macmillan. And so the problem now can no longer be hidden. It can no longer be said that we have a new economy and that globalism is making us richer, and all of this sort of BS that the economics profession used for over a decade to hide the fact that the United States economy and other first world economies were being eviscerated. All of this started with the collapse of the Soviet Union, because that changed attitudes in India and China and made their massive labor forces available to Western capital. And Wall Street started, and large retailers like Walmart, started pressuring American corporations not to produce in the United States, where labor costs a lot, but to produce in China, for example, where it was very inexpensive, because the profits of the firm would explode. And therefore, the earnings would go up, and Wall Street would go up, and shareholders would be happy, and management could, by so-called performance, evade the $1 million cap that Congress had stuck on their salaries. You know, the Congress passed a law some years ago that American CEOs cannot be paid more than $1 million a year and have it deducted as a tax expense from their earnings, from their taxable earnings, unless their pay was performance related. So what is performance related? It's getting the profits up. And so they got the profits up by using Chinese labor instead of labor in Detroit, Michigan, or Cincinnati, or Illinois, Indiana, Missouri, wherever. And that is what has happened. That is the story.
What I'm reading now, Dr. Roberts, coming out of the think tanks in Washington and particularly out of the Republican Party, is they take a look at this outsourcing problem now that they recognize as a problem, and their solutions, the more and more what I'm reading, they believe that instead of trying to unwind the problem as it has been created, their thinking is that they want to try to force wages in America down to create China-America wage parity, and that this will bring the jobs back to America if the wages in America can be competitive with wages in China, and they want to bring that average income in of America from where it is approximately $40,000 a year now down to maybe $4,000 or $5,000 a year. That's the solution being put on the table. Does that make any sense?
Well, it's mindless, isn't it? Because first of all, you couldn't do it. But assuming you did it, does that also reduce their mortgage payments, their car payments, their credit card payment?
No, it doesn't. And then what you end up with is a debtor's prison run by Wall Street. Isn't the end game for Wall Street to run a debtor's prison known as the United States of America with 330 million prisoners all in debt and not able to make more than a Chinese wage and being told that's the only way out of their problem?
Well, I don't know if that's the aim or not, but that would be the result. But obviously, unless something fundamentally collapsed all the structure of prices in the United States, and nobody could live on $5,000 a year, you wouldn't be in debtor's prison, you'd be in the graveyard. The whole country would be dead. So, you can't reduce wages without, particularly in a country where everybody now, or the vast majority of them, are on the margin. We have rising homelessness, rising dependency on food stamps and income support programs, foreclosures. You can't force down wages without collapsing also the structure of prices so that the real incomes are not ruined. If you try to ruin people's real incomes when they're already struggling, you don't have a debtor's prison, you have a graveyard.
But Dr. Roberts, 1 in 7 people in America already live on food stamps. So they're already living on $4,000 or $5,000 a year in government assistance. Or, food stamps are just another way of printing money, which brings me to my next question about inflation. And money printing is surging around the world. And you have people like Howard Schultz at Starbucks and others blaming the speculators for the rise in commodity prices due to this raging increase in inflation. Is he correct to pinpoint the speculators? Is there something else going on, Dr. Roberts?
Well, there are two things going on. And yes, the speculators are in part to blame, particularly the speculation unleashed by Goldman Sachs when they got the United States government to remove position limits on speculation. You see, prior to a few years ago, speculators could not take big positions in these markets because their function was to smooth supply over time. So, for example, a grain crop comes in and it's larger than the cereal companies want at the moment. So somebody has to kind of buy up stocks and allocate them through time, but they were always regulated so that they could not buy up the whole market. And by buying up the whole market, drive up prices. So that is going on now. But also, you're correct. Since the dollar's reserve currency and so many commodities are priced in dollars, as you create more and more dollars and start turning it into funny money, that itself drives up the prices. And so you have both things happening. The prices of food and oil rise because of the weakening of the dollar's exchange value, but they also rise because of the activities of speculators, which are different than they were a few years ago. Now it's just another racket. You know, they can dump hundreds of billions of dollars into some commodity market, drive up the price, make a whole bunch of money.
Finally, Dr. Roberts, last question: Is there any cure in the pipeline for any of this?
I don't think so. I think that the United States economy is now stuck with long-term high unemployment, and it will probably rise because so much of the value added has been moved offshore, and the growth of tradable goods in the United States, of industries that produce tradable goods that could be exported, has been stagnant for about 18 years. So there's no way to deal with the trade deficit, and given the high unemployment, there's no way to deal with the budget deficit. So the United States is kind of trapped with two large deficits, with large unemployment, and it's dealing with the situation of financing its budget deficit by printing money. And so this is destroying the dollar and will increasingly show up in a falling dollar exchange rate and in rising domestic inflation. So one can't imagine a worse economic outlook than the United States confronts at this time. I would say it's equally as bad, if not worse, than what Gorbachev faced in the Soviet Union in its final days. So what is going to happen? I have no idea. Given the lack of intelligence in Washington, the lack of foresight in the media, the prostitute character of the American economics profession, which is always covering up for the mistakes in exchange for grants and speaking fees, I don't see how the problem can be addressed. And when they get to the problem and it forces itself upon them, they'll find some scapegoat. They'll blame China. They'll do some crazy thing. But to actually fix the problem, I don't think there's any chance of it.
All right, Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, that's all the time for we have. Thanks so much for being on the edge.
Glad to be with you, Max.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of On the Edge with me, Max Keiser. I want to thank my guest, Dr. Paul Craig Roberts. If you want to send me an email, please do so at ontheedge@presstv.com. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.